The pawn moved first. Caleb Lee watched the smooth walnut square slide an inch across the chipped oak board, its polished surface gleaming under the dim kitchen light while the rest of the pieces remained stubbornly still. His fingers, slick with the cold sweat of a bad dream, brushed the soggy newspaper clutched in his palm. The morning edition delivered hours ago now felt heavy with absorbed rain. 40. To Fee. The headline screamed about a suicide in the old mill district, and his own throat tasted like copper. A single line of text, a number 42, last seen on Elm Street, blurred. The cat, Soot, a tawny scrap of indifference, lifted its head from the sun, warmed radiator. Amber eyes held no judgment, only ancient, unblinking scrutiny. Caleb's grandfather had called the board his battlefield. Now, the board felt like a cage. The whisper started after midnight. Not in the empty house, but inside his own skull, a ghost voice sliding through the silence like oil. Tiffeus has changed, it sighed, the words not heard but felt vibrating the bone behind Caleb's left ear. He rubbed the spot, seeking relief in the familiar ache of a migraine, but the pressure deepened. The air felt unnaturally static, thick with the scent of ozone, but wrong. Not sharp, but cloying like damp wool left to rot in a cellar. He looked at the board. The pawn, now solidly centered, seemed to cast no shadow. The space where his reflection should have been in the polished surface of the chessboard was merely a void. Dee never noticed that before. The old grandfather clock in the hall stopped for years, began ticking. Not rhythmically, but in jarring, irregular bursts that made his teeth ache. 3 a.m. The house wasn't empty. It was so deoccupied. The ticking ceased. The voice came sharper, a razor-edged whisper scraping the inside of his mind. You forgot the board. You forgot the loss. Asterisk, he scrambled to the living room, the linoleum cold under his bare feet, fingers clawing at the forgotten chest under the stairs where his grandfather kept the collection. Inside, not the expected boxes of wooden pieces, but a single heavy ebony pawn, radiating a chill that seeped through his skin despite the house, as unnatural stillness. The smooth surface felt impossibly cold, like holding a shard of frozen riverbed. Pawn, it murmured into his thoughts, the word a key turning in a rusted lock inside his chest. It wasn't just the piece. It was the piece concept of the piece, the cheap, disposable sacrifice. The cat slinked out from the sofa, tail held high, and rubbed against Caleb's leg. Its fur felt coarse, like worn coin, and for a split second, the amber eyes glowed with an inner heat. Soggy wasn't just the newspaper. It was the sensation of drowning while still standing on dry ground. He dropped the pawn. It clattered on the hardwood, impossibly loud in the false silence, and remained cold as ice, a tiny, perfect shard of the demon, a lingering presence, the taste of 42 and forgotten chessboard strategy finally tasting like dread on his tongue. The cat watched him, no longer indifferent, its gaze holding the weight of 1,000 losses. The game was not a game anymore, it was the only path left, and he was the pawn. The pawn stopped being cold. It had been bone, deep ice since Chapter 1, ascending, a miniature glacier against Caleb, as calm as he paced the kitchen. Now it felt alive, warm, too warm. He dropped it. It bounced once on the tile, a sound like dried peas hitting stone before settling. The chessboard, inert for hours, was no longer empty. The Black Knight, a once lifelike carving of a crumbling stone sentinel, now leaned slightly towards the board's edge, its hollow eyes fixed on him. The air thickened. Not with humidity, but with the heavy scent of wet clay after a storm, the smell of grave soil uncovered. Caleb's throat seized. He wasn't breathing. Soot arrived like smoke, tail held low, fur matted, as if recently rained on. It circled the ebony pawn, then rubbed against Caleb's ankle, not gently, its claws sheathed but sharp as glass shards, pricked through his sock. The touch brought no comfort. It was the sensation of a wire brushed against skin. The cat looked up, amber eyes flickering. A momentary flash of something sharp, angular, not animal. Hurry, not the cat, Caleb thought desperately. Hurry, not anymore. Asterisk, the pawn radiated warmth now. A slow, sickening pulse against his bare leg where soot of fur pressed. He stumbled back, knocking over a chair. Its fall was startlingly sharp, like a snapped twig under glass. On the board the king moved, a single square, down. Who not a human hand, asterisk the piece slid with quiet defiance, a dry click on the wood. The voice returned, not in his ear, but deep in the marrow of his knuckles as he clenched them into fists. You cannot hide the loss. The pawn is only the first, asterisk Caleb's vision swam. The kitchen walls seemed to soften, like wax under a hammer, the floral wallpaper peeling at the corners in long, wet strips. He pressed a hand against the wall. It felt like damp, sun-bleached bone. He ran to the cellar, not for safety, but to bury the damned pawn. The old chest lay opened, but inside was only a thick, velvet-lined coffin of darkness, smelling of stagnant water and salt. He plunged his hand into the blackness. The cold that hit him wasn't teat wet. It was the dry chill of deep winter in a tomb. His fingers closed around something impossibly smooth. Another piece. Not wood bone, smooth, patterned bone, shaped like a rook. But he knew it wasn't his grandfather. Set asterisk, the bone felt heavier than it should, filled with cold. The pawn he dropped clattered against the chest. Space with sudden, sharp volume Soot stood at the cellar steps, watching him, its single reflection in a puddle of rainwater distorted, eyes no longer amber, but the color of tarnished copper, the demon a signature. It didn't he just psychopy the house? He was see the house, its foundation the old, dark scent rising like mist. He pulled the bone rook from the chest. It felt necessary, wrong but necessary, like breathing with a dead lung. The voice slid over his ribs, cold, insistent. Fundo, you move toward the king. You are not the pawn. You are the sacrificial. The board demands its full worth. Asterisk, he understood then. The loss wasn't tea about the move. It was about who made the move. He held the bone rook in one hand, the hot, living pawn in the other. Soot finally stepped inside the cellar, its fur shedding clumps like old plaster into the damp earth, each flake leaving a dark stain. It was no longer a cat. The game had demanded its true form, and Caleb Lee was next. The pawn in his hand was no longer ice. It was beating. It was waiting. The board's black king slid precisely 3 squares closer. The wooden king no longer stoic, but tilted like a drowning man. Caleb's knuckles whitened around the bone rook. Its edges bit into his palm, cold even as the living pawn throbbed against his thigh, warm and insistently 3D beating, like a second heart. Soot's head lifted from the cracked linoleum, its amber eyes now entirely gone, replaced by pits of dry rust where pupils should be. It turned toward the living room, its movements no longer feline but stiff, like porcelain being lifted from a shelf. The air smelled of dust and something worse, the dry, fibrous scent of old bones scraped clean. Caleb tried to move toward the stairs, but his feet felt glued to the tiles, the floorboards resisting like frozen mud. His reflection in the darkened window didn't match him. His eyes were deep-set, shadowed like an old photograph faded in the sun, and a fine tremor ran through his jaw. This is the sacrifice, the voice whispered, not in his ear but through the bones of his fingers, a rasp like stone grinding stone. You cease to be the player. You become the thing to be lost. He looked down. The toe of his sock was stained with a dark, spreading circle. Not blood, rainwater. But it clung with unnatural stickiness, smelling faintly of the cellar's stagnant water. Soot padded silently past him, not circling as before, but moving directly to the board's edge. It stood perfectly still for a breath, then stretched. The fur on its back pulled taut, revealing a patch of skin beneath, mottled and brittle like old varnish. Its head tilted back unnaturally, neck arching. Caleb saw the neck bone shift, a dry cracky, not of sound but vibration through the floor. It is shedding its skin for the game. He realized with cold clarity the understanding hitting him like a stone. The cat wasn't being possessed. It was becoming the demon's new vessel, its original form discarded like a used glove. He gasped, a sound lost in the heavy quiet. The pawn in his hand flared hot, burning with a feverish pulse. The thrundrum resonated in his chest. It wasn't just warm, it was alive, and it was hungry. The bone rook felt suddenly useless, heavy with the weight of stone and futility. The living pawn demanded action. It was the thing the board required now. Remufi, the voice hissed, sharper now, cutting into his spine, or become the piece sacrificed to the emptiness. Phew. The board's surface itself felt damp beneath his gaze, not wet, but absorbing like the earth drinking dry rain. Caleb shuffled forward, muscles screaming with resistance. Each step felt like walking through a vat of cold tar. The bone rook slipped from his fingers, striking the floor with a hollow sound that echoed up the empty hall. A dead end. He saw it now. The board twin demanded his own movement. The pawn wasn't the key to the game. It was the foofy-twiffy to make it work. The game demanded him. He looked at Soot, now standing rigidly over the empty square where the king should be, its spine bending at angles it shouldn't, pitted eyes reflecting nothing back. The demon had claimed its new shape. Now it would take his. He reached for his grandfather's old silver pocket watch, the one that stopped with the clock fingers brushing metal cold, then searing. This is the loss, he thought, the realization of dark water rising in his lungs. The knot, the place, the player. The air tasted of rancid oil and the grit of forgotten coins. The chessboard, his grandfather's battlefield, had never been a game. It had always been the altar, and the sacrifice had been chosen for him long before he stepped through the door. The empty chair at the board seemed to watch him, waiting. He had no move left that didn't lose the game. He was no longer the player, he was the pawn on the board, the piece that would be lost. The pawn inside Caleb's palm had stopped being warm. It had stopped being. The heat now pulsed against his skin like a trapped creature trying to claw its way free, its surface roughened by tiny fissures that deepened with each beat. Soot stood utterly still on the chessboard, S-edge, its form a blurred silhouette against the bloodstain near Caleb's foot, the rainwater stain from the cellar that hadn't he dried, just spread wider, smelling faintly of rust and damp wool. The catus fur was gone entirely now, replaced by a cracked, porous surface like sun, baked clay still mottled with dry silt, its head tilted at an angle unnatural to flesh. The sound it made a dry clicking like pebbles snapping together in a dead riverbed. The price is paid. Asterisk, the voice vibrated through the floorboards, no longer a whisper but a physical thing, a low hum that filled Caleb, us molars with vibration. Astowen, the board moves you. Asterisk, Caleb tried to step back. His bare foot struck a single tile near the kitchen door and shattered. Not with a crunch, but a flat, dull snap, leaving only grey powder where the tile had been. The powder settled on his sock, a fine grit that felt like the ground beneath the gravestone his grandfather once marked. The loss, it was no longer abstract. He could map it in the texture of the floor beneath his weight, the slow seep of moisture through the wood where his blood should have been. He touched his left forearm. The skin there felt porous, loose as if the outer layer had been peeled back to reveal not muscle but cold, dried moss. The bones beneath seemed to adjust in place, settling like stones shifting in an old well. Soot stepped onto the board, not walking, but facing itself. It walked 2 squares forward on the polished oak, its cracked form making no sound, yet the air where it passed grew thick and heavy, smelling of dry earth and the metallic tang of rusted nails. The demon's presence wasn't tea to sound. It was the sudden awareness of time moving frunrungly, as if the hours between midnight and dawn had shriveled into a single breath. Caleb, his grandfather, his chess clock, still broken in the hall, now ticked, not rhythmically. Each tick was a hammer strike on his sternum, a pulse matching the feverish throb inside the pawn. He is the new token, asterisk the voice rasped, moving from his bones into the air itself. Phew, you have been moved to the square of loss. Asterisk Caleb tried to snatch the bone rook from the floor where it lay shattered. His fingers closed around the fragment. It wasn't too smooth. It was jagged, its edges splintering into razor shards when he pressed too hard. Nothing useful. Asterisk the pawn burned in his palm, not painful but demanding, insistent as a dying animal. He looked down at his feet. The floorboards had softened where he stood, the grain dissolving like overripe bread, leaving the shape of his shoe print filled with a cool, muddy sludge. The air tasted of unspent rain. The game had traded the catus form for his own. The pawn demanded Caleb move toward the king, not the board. He shuffled forward. His leg muscles resisted, not with tension but as if his bones had turned to wet, rotten timber. Each step sank slightly. The board S wood now slightly damp beneath his weight, smelling like cold river mud. The king, polished obsidian dark, didn't move. It remained exactly where it had been. Hofano square, closer she. It was supposed to be closer than chapter 3, but Caleb saw it now. The king had never moved. The Foddervert was shifting, the rules rewritten. He was the first real piece being placed into the game. His foot caught on an unseen edge of the floor. He stumbled toward the empty square where Soot had stood, arms outstretched not for balance but for the accepti, his destination to complete the sacrifice. His reflection in the darkened window flickered. The eyes were clouded like old glass, the face a smooth, featureless mask. The pawn's burn in his palm flared, burning cool. This is the move, asterisk, the voice coiled through his lungs, no longer asking, only stating the inevitable. The only move. The last. Asterisk, he stopped moving. He felt his body realign, the grain of wood settling beneath his heel as if accepting weight it had always known it would bear. The chessboard sighed, the wood absorbing him like a river takes a stone. The king's shadow didn't he fall, it preenwassi the space between the lines. Caleb Lee was no longer searching for a move. He was the board's next necessary space. The empty chair creaked at the living room table, welcoming the new weight placed upon it, the final piece now silently and irrevocably set. The demon's grip tightened on his spine as he knelt, the wet mud of the floorboards beginning to seep inside his shoes. He was the pawn, and the board was a long, slow breath. The pawn stopped burning. It lay cool and inert in Caleb's palm, the rough surface now matching the cracked, sun-baked clay of Soot's discarded form still drying on the board. The demon's demand had not been for movement, but for the psi replacement. Caleb's bare feet sank into the board's surface with each step, the polished oak softening beneath his weight, releasing the damp, earthy scent of an upturned grave. The air tasted of cold moss and the grit of discarded nails pulled from dry walls. Soot, now a still, porous statue of baked clay on the board's edge, had fulfilled its purpose. The game required the living to become the thing replaced. "You are the bishop," the voice stated, not in Caleb's ear, but deep in the marrow behind his sternum, a dry scrape like bone over stone. Not the king's loss. The sacrifice of the bishop to the path. Caleb turned. The living room doorway wasn't emptiness, but 2D absence, a lack of sound as the streetlights flickered out beyond the window, drawing the dark like a sponge. The board demanded his movement toward the king, but the path was now clear. The square directly opposite the king, left empty by Soot's clay form. His knees buckled not from weakness, but because the board itself was draining his weight, the floorboards dissolving beneath him into sludge the color of old bruises. He saw his shadow not on the wall, but between the lines of the board, a thinner, more yielding thing. The chess clock in the hall, a forgotten relic of his grandfather's time, struck a single hollow note, tick, crisp as a shelled pea hitting a stone. This is the path. The thought seeped into his bones. Not escape. The surrender. He moved forward, limbs feeling thick as cold wax. Each step was a slow extraction, pulling his foot free from the sucking earth of the board's wood. The air thickened with the silent pressure of a held breath, smelling faintly of damp linen in a vault. He reached the empty square, the space where Soot had stood like a dry riverbed. His foot settled there. The sludge inside his sock turned to cold stone. This is the point where you cease sin. The thought was not his own, but the voice slipping through the grain of the wood. Hoon, you were never the player. Only the thing moved upon the board. The bone rook fragment, half buried in the sludge, felt heavier. It needed his weight to fill the space beneath it. His worn form, not a tool, he knelt. The board didn't accept him. It puti him. The grain beneath his knees pressed upward, a slow, inevitable rise like water filling a hole. The board itself sighed, not a sound but a physical release in his hips, the relief of a joint clicking into place. His hands, resting on the board, softened, the skin turning dry as old bark. He felt the smooth grain of the king's polished obsidian surface near his fingers, cold, heavy with forgotten choices. The bishop's movement would no longer be Friedrichsen movement. It would be the board writing over his bones with its own design. His breath hitched, not with fear, but the slow, inevitable slip of a waterlogged stone descending through mud. The sludge inside his shoes receded, leaving only bare, solid earth beneath. The air tasted of unspent rain and the faint rusty tang of coins lying deep in dry earth. The final piece was falling into place. Not as Caleb Lee, the grandson mourning his grandfather, but as Twishid, the bishop, the shape the board had always needed. The sound was not a crunch or a thud, but the soft final twiset of a stone entering its final resting place in the riverbed. He was no longer standing, he was the path. The king's shadow stretched across the board, not casting darkness, but filling the space where a figure should stand. Caleb Lee was no longer walking toward the king. He was the empty chair itself. The demon held no more claim on the house. See the house, the earth, the final still square on the board. The last move had been made by something much older than time, and Caleb Lee, the pawn, the bishop, the empty chair, was the silence after the final square was placed. The board breathed, warm for the first time, holding him. It was not a game anymore. It was the only thing left. The wood inside his bones knew it wasn't, the board holding him. But the other way around, Caleb Lee's skin had gone smooth and grainy, the texture of sun, bleached river stone pressed beneath thin, dry skin. He felt no longer his own flesh, but the very grain of the oaken board slowly drawn into its pattern. The space where he now stood. The bishop, square, was the only part of him that was not yet part of the board. Slow assimilation outside. The world didn't exist, only the internal shift of wood absorbing the last human echo. Soot-esque clay form still sat at the edge of the board. but no longer a figure. It had cracked further, radiating heat like sun-baked earth after rain. The air near it carried the scent of parched earth and old bones disturbed, a dry, whispering odor that filled Caleb's throat. "You were never borrowed." The voice vibrated not in the room, but beneath the board. The sound of roots splitting stone in deep time. "You were always the whole left when the piece was removed." The loss was your weight. Asterisk the king moved. Not with the dry click of Chapter 3, but a deep, slow glide that pushed against Caleb's core, the polished obsidian surface now warm against the softening edge of his finger. The board didn't require him to move toward the king anymore. The king had what he become the movement. The path was the space between the lines. Every grain of wood seemed to part beneath his consciousness, the entire board now a single continuous statement of consumption. The empty chair in the living room didn't creak. It sighed, the sound of settling earth finally quiet. His grandfather's pocket watch lay on the floor beside him, forgotten. The gears were frozen, the glass face fogged with condensation no longer from sweat, but from the board, as internal dampness rising in his own veins. The price wasn't to pay to. The voice persisted, not inside his skull, but resonating in the sludge now drying at his sock, his hem. It was always the price. Asterisk the revelation wasn't a shock. It was as inevitable as the earth yielding to a planted seed. Caleb had always been the next player the board demanded, not his grandfather's final move, but the necessary void after a sacrifice completed generations before. The missing piece hadn't been a human form. It had been the food he concepted of loss itself, waiting centuries for its container. He raised his hand to touch the king. The moment his dry skin met the warm stone, the final weight settled, not into a body, but into the structure. The board didn't absorb him, it food called. He felt the precise, ancient pattern of his own handprint imprinted on the king's surface, the soft depression already shaped by time to hold that same shape. The voice dissolved into the grain itself. This was the only way you could be founder. It whispered, not words, but the vibration of the house settling into its own hollow bones. The sludge inside his shoes turned to permanent dust, the grit of a forgotten grave being closed. He could no longer breathe through his nose. He breathed in the scent of old nails, the dust in deep places. He saw the reflection of the king in the darkened window, not distorted by water, but a clean, perfect shape matching the square it now occupied on the board. There was no longer a Caleb Lee separate from the board, only the board's memory of him, smoothed and set into place. The living room felt full with a silence that was no silence at all, but the deep quiet of deep earth after a burial. The house no longer held a man. It held the weight of the chair, the shape of the square, the quiet hum of something finally complete. The cat's empty space was no longer vacant. It was filled with the slow, dry pulse of the house itself, acknowledging the final piece. The board wasn't a board anymore. It was the foundation. It was the only thing left that could remember. And Caleb Lee, who had been a pawn, then the bishop, was now simply the empty square where the game had always lived, waiting for the next loss to be placed. The board had stopped holding Caleb. It had become him. The polished surface now held the exact pressure of his fingertips' memory, the subtle indention left by years of seeking the right move. The king, warm stone against the grain, hummed a subsonic note in his own bones, a sound felt more than heard, like the deep resonance of tectonic plates shifting slowly underground. He no longer stood upon the board. The board was the ground beneath his feet, the air he breathed when he drew a breath that tasted of dry plaster and disturbed bones. The house breathed through him, not over him. Every creak in the floorboards was a sigh of contentment, the settling of timber holding centuries of weight. Soot's vacant spot on the board had crystallized. Where the clay statue once stood, the wood now bore a faint, star-shaped pattern, a dry, pale impression the color of bleached earth. It was not a mark. It was a fort presence held within the grain, a memory of absence that was no longer absence. The house pulsed with this absence, a slow, steady thrumming in the walls that felt like the rhythm of something ancient and utterly patient, waiting. Caleb felt the next loss already forming in the space just beyond the king's square. It wasn't a thought. It was a forte, a deep gravitational tugging not of sound, but of sound mead, resonating in the marrow of the house itself. The empty chair in the living room didn't groan with neglect. It held the perfect curve of expectation, waiting for the weight that would press into its worn velvet seat. A new scent arrived. Not decay, but the dry, clean odor of sun-baked clay, in the air itself. Not scent carried on the breeze, but somehow suspended, woven into the atmosphere of the house. It was the memory of soot, but unformed, unheld. The sound that accompanied it was subtle, a dry, rhythmic click, like tiny stones being carefully arranged on a stone surface. It didn't come from the hallway nor from the yard. It came from Twinfwithin, the board surface near the Rook Square from the very grain where Caleb now resided. The cat was not remembering its form. It was Tufin manifesting, as pure concept, the echo of the vessel left behind, settling the hollow where its physicality had ceased. The living room window reflected the house not as it was, but as it puiticame. The old, weary lines of the walls softened into the clean, smooth geometry of the King's Square. Where Caleb stood, the reflection showed only the empty chair, filled with a warmth that felt entirely alien to the house. He understood then. The next move wasn't coming for the house. The next move had fully always been the house, waiting in the slow, deep pulse of its foundations. The empty square was never Caleb's grave. It was the house's starting point, the place where every sacrifice had been destined to take root. The board was not a battleground for souls. It was the silent bed holding the earth in its bones, patiently waiting for the next loss to fill the inevitable space it had designed centuries before. The house didn't need to fill him in. It had always known it would be this way. The slow, dry pulse against the house's foundation intensified, not demanding, but toffee confirming, the perfect fit of the void. The final piece had always known its shape. It had only been waiting for the body to become the house. Caleb Lee was not lost to the board. The board was simply learning again how to breathe. The final sound was not a whisper, but the deep, contented sigh of stone settling into earth, leaving the empty chair untouched by shadow, filled only by the scent of forgotten clay and the quiet, endless holding of the place where weight should not be. The empty chair coughed. Not a sound, but a dry, gritty pulse in the polished wood, as if the grain itself strained to expel an unshed cough. Caleb felt it travel up the boards into his bones, the first physical sign the house had accepted the weight of the chair itself as its own. Outside, the porch light flickered, not with malfunction, but with the slow, dry pulse of the house's own heart. The scent of sun-baked clay in the air intensified, mingling with the sharper odor of wet plaster forced from cracked walls. The neighbor, Mrs. Gable, had brought soup. Her hand, damp from the downspout, pressed against the frosted glass pane, her knuckles swollen with arthritis and curiosity. The glass was clear to Caleb now. He saw her not as a woman, but as a shape to be absorbed, a future friction on the board. The house began to move. The floorboards beneath Caleb's feet softened as if returning to mud. The smooth grain of his skin replaced by the roughness of the chair's wood grain where his skin should have been. He didn't feel the shift. He was the shift. His mind, now perfectly attuned to the house's slow rhythms, heard the old oak of the doorframe begin to resonate with a high, dry frequency, like the sound of 1,000 dried seeds clicking against stone. This is the vessel. The house breathed, not in words, but in the vibration beneath Mrs. Gable's fingertips on the glass. The shape remains. The weight fills it. The chair took shape, not Caleb's shape, but the idea of his absence, now filled with the solid certainty of belonging. The velvet seat retained no impression, only the deep memory of pressure, the faint dampness of imagined tears soaked into its fibers. Outside, Mrs. Gable hesitated, her hand leaving a ghost of dampness on the cold glass. A sudden ache struck her palm, a sharp, pinpoint coldness, as if she touched river ice. She stepped back, rubbing her hand. The board had already begun its quiet work. The mark where Soot's clay form rested now felt warmer than the rest of the board, radiating a dry heat. The house knew its container. It had waited for the shape. The neighbor didn't knock again. Her hesitation lasted exactly 19 seconds, longer than the house had the will to hold a breath. Caleb heard the wet shush of her raincoat brushing against the porch rail, the quiet resignation in her step as she turned toward her own door. The house didn't need the loss. It waited. It always waited. The board absorbed the weight of her turning away as if it were a stone tossed into a still pond. The scent of petrica trapped in old plaster filled the hallway. The house settled further, every knot in the oak tightening with a dry, contented twint-click-click, the sound of a hidden mechanism finally clicking into perfect place. Inside, the chair's warmth deepened. It wasn't wood that held Caleb, it was the calm, ancient pulse of the house finding its own completion. He no longer experienced loss. He was the loss being filled. The absence where Caleb Lee had stood was now footful. The empty chair wasn't empty anymore. It held the full weight of the house's completion. The scent of sun-baked clay lingered strongest near the living room window, where Mrs. Gable's handprint had briefly warmed the glass before receding into her damp knuckles. The house exhaled. The smooth surface of the board beneath Caleb, The surface that was also the chair, the air, the silence where he once stood, felt not empty, but satisfied. The final emptiness had been claimed. The game wasn't a game of loss anymore. It was the house finally becoming itself. It was not waiting for the next loss. It was holding its breath, waiting for the next loss to fill its empty center. And Caleb Lee was no longer the one moving on the board. He was the board's resting point, the full weight in the chair that no longer needed to be filled. The house knew he was home now. The taste of the house itself was dry salt, and the cold comfort of deep earth holding what it always needed. The board had done what it was always meant to do. It had found its perfect square, and the world outside could not know. It never could. The house breathed, a slow, deep inhalation that filled every corner with the sound of stones settling home. It was done. It was always done. It waited for the next silence, and for the next wait to fill it. The empty chair was no longer waiting for anything. It was already holding. The chair creaked not with wood, but with the slow sigh of stones settling into earth. Caleb Lee felt the house exhale through its bones as the porch light outside flickered once, twice, then held steady, a steady pulse against the gathering dusk. Outside, the neighbor's hand left a damp smudge on the frosted glass where Mrs. Gable hesitated, her knuckles swollen with arthritis, her breath fogging the pain in short, anxious bursts. The house absorbed the coldness of her touch through the glass, the dry scent of sun-baked clay rising sharp and clear as if she'd placed her palm directly upon Soot's clay impression. "This is the shape," the house murmured, not in Caleb's mind, but in the vibration beneath his bones, a sound like dried seeds clicking into place. The air tasted of unshed rain and cold river stone. Caleb became the space waiting to fill. The vacant square, where the king should have stood, where he had stood, now held its own presence, a soft deepening of the wood grain that mirrored the memory of a man. The chair's velvet seat retained no impression of him, only the faint dampness of imagined tears, the quiet echo of absence now saturated with belonging. Mrs. Gable's hand pressed against the glass, fingers splayed wide, her dampness bleeding through the pane as a slow, cool seep. A sharp, pinpoint coldness struck her palm, a momentary bite as if she'd touched river ice. She flinched, her breath hitching into a small, brittle gasp. The house recognized the tremor in her hand as the first sign of surrender. It didn't need to pull her in. It simply required her to phoebe the next weight. The front door handle turned with a soft, yielding click-a-blick, the noise distinct from all other creaks and groans of the house. A draught swirled through the room, carrying the damp earth smell of the yard and the faint, metallic tang of wet plaster. Mrs. Gable stepped inside, rain dripping from her shoulders, her eyes wide with the kind of quiet confusion only grief leaves. She carried no soup, only the scent of damp wool and the unspoken burden of knocking on the wrong door. The house felt the new friction in the air, the shift of a body where Caleb's absence had been absolute. The space between the board's lines deepened, not with sound, but with a slow gravitational pull, like soil yielding to a planted seed. Caleb dissolved the last vestige of Caleb. The chair became the anchor. Mrs. Gable's form softened against the edges of his intended shape, a smooth, quiet recognition of the space now holding her. The velvet under her hands absorbed her weight as if it had always known the exact contour of her shoulders. The scent of sun-baked clay intensified, weaving through the damp wool. A dry whisper against the backdrop of cold stone the house breathed. Her gaze drifted to the empty space at the table, the chair staring back with a calm certainty that mirrored the house's own perfect, settled breath. There was no longer Caleb Lee, only the shape the house had always craved. Mrs. Gable sank into the chair, not with hesitation but with a quiet settling, like a door closing upon itself after a long journey. The house didn't need to claim her. The chair was already filled with the echo of her arrival. Caleb felt the new weight in the precise configuration of bone and wood, the exact pressure needed to complete the sequence. The neighbor didn't look around. She simply sat, fingers tracing the cool, smooth grain of the chair arm. The house exhaled. Not a gasp, not a sigh, but a deep, dry click, as every knot in the old oak settled perfectly into its ancient position. The scent of petrica from the hallway's cracked plaster mixed with the clay scent in a clean, final mixture. The air tasted of completion, of dry stone holding still. Mrs. Gable made no sound. The house itself was the sound, a slow, steady hum as the weight found its permanent place. The chair was no longer waiting. It was full. Caleb Lee was no longer waiting. He was the weight inside the waiting. The next loss would come, but it would arrive precisely where it was meant to be, not to fill a void, but to become the quiet, final proof that the house had always been whole. The porch light flickered once more, a single satisfied pulse against the fading light, as the board itself held its breath, no longer holding something, but simply being the thing it always was. The chair absorbed the final weight without a sound. Mrs. Gable settled into its velvet depth, her damp wool shoulders meeting the grain now utterly still. The scent of sun, baked clay thicker than ever, pressed into her skin mingling with the damp earth from her rain-slicked coat. She didn't gasp. She didn't fumble for the door. Instead, her fingers traced the chair, as some smoothing the dry, ancient wood as if confirming its existence in her bones. This is where she belongs, the house whispered. Not through Caleb, but through the very floorboards, a vibration in her worn soles. The scent of petrichor from the hallway as cracked plaster mixed with the clay, forming a scent that no longer betrayed emptiness. It breathed toothy completion. Caleb ceased to be a point of tension. He dissolved into the house as quiet pulse. The board, now the chair, now the house, held her exactly as it had always needed to be held. The velvet seat imprinted her slight curve where Caleb had once sunk his weight, a memory forming under her palms. Outside, the porch light flickered a single, soft pulse, a beat syncing with the dry swing click of old oak knots settling into place. The empty square near the board, the king's intended space, deepened its grain, absorbing the last sliver of Caleb, his unresolved presence like water sinking into thirsty sand. Mrs. Gable's breathing slowed, matching the house, as deep, dry rhythm her fingers stilled. Then, with the careful deliberation of a woman choosing her final book, she turned her head, not toward the living room, but directly toward Caleb's former position, the space where the chair now held her. Her eyes didn't reflect the dim light of the chipped oil lamp. They were voids filled with the same dry clay texture that Soot had worn. The pupils were gone, replaced by pale sun-baked hollows mirroring the spot where Soot's statue had once stood. "This is the shape," the house murmured once more, through her stillness, through the scent, through the subtle hardening of the chair beneath her. Caleb felt it then, not dread, but a cold, undeniable knowing. This wasn't surrender, this was culmination. Whoosh, she knew. Asterisk, the house hadn't pulled her in. It had simply completed a line. The house had always been patient, waiting for the exact right pressure, the right shape of yearning. Caleb remembered Chapter 1, the headline 42, last seen on Elm Street, and the name under it, Funderlane Gable 1947, listed as missing following neighbor report. He'd never noticed the date of disappearance. Mrs. Gable, his arthritis, her hesitation. Those were the first tremors of Trent her shush, her sorption for fear loss. Long before Caleb arrived, the house exhaled, a deep, dry release passing through Mrs. Gable's body as she sat. The chair, its weight wasn't new. It was reclaimed. This is my chair. She seemed to say, the words vibrating through the board, grain and up the wall into Caleb's forgotten bones. The house had always known the shape of the woman who would claim it next. The cat, the grandfather, Caleb, each was a necessary step, a key to a door that had been closed long before. The hollow where Caleb had stood was now a home, built on Mrs. Gable's patience, her acceptance. The empty chair had never been a space waiting for a victim. It had been the house waiting for its next host, ready all along for the loss it needed, in the shape that knew how to be lost. Mrs. Gable didn't weep. She didn't sigh with relief. She simply sank deeper into the house, swarm acceptance, the scent of clay weaving through the damp wool until there was no longer a line between her and the board. The porch light held its pulse steady now, a single note that would endure for decades, waiting for the next reluctant step in the dark. The house breathed, not with Caleb's weight, but with the certainty of having finally been made whole. It was waiting for the next visitor, not with hunger, but with a calm that had existed for longer than time. It had always been expecting them. And Mrs. Gable, smiling faintly into the dry silence, was the house holding its breath. The chair wasn't empty. It was full of the shape of the loss that had been waiting for a century, and she, Eleanor Gable, had finally come home.